The fun in raiding and in dungeons is learning the mechanics on the spot. What you guys call blind runs. I've always been a fan of that. I never want to know what to do before going into a fight cold. I always try to figure it out because that to me, it's like a puzzle to me. It's like figuring out a puzzle. When you figure out a puzzle without any help, there's some gratification to that. Hello. Today we're going to talk about Final Fantasy XIV versus WoW. Everybody's favorite topic. Yes. But this has to do with raid mechanics. And I've seen this topic come up plenty of times about, mainly from Final Fantasy players digging at WoW players about how they're reliant on DeadlyBossMods and modifications and things that help you with mechanics and raids. And I think a lot of the discussions surround that DBM is required to raid and WoW. And I, having played WoW, I know it's not required. But a lot of people tend to rely on it. I do agree with that. A lot of people tend to rely on DBM. So I saw this post over on Reddit and I was like, man, that's a saucy, juicy topic, because this guy says, I've come to the conclusion that Final Fantasy XIV players do not have worse raid awareness, talking about the player base, but rather do not have crutches to rely on, such as DeadlyBossMods. And before I go on, there is something equivalent to DeadlyBossMods in Final Fantasy XIV. It's called CACBot, and it is heavily frowned upon by the community. People, if you tell them you use CACBot, you're going to get the side eye. You're going to get the side eye from a lot of folks, because it is in the same vein as DeadlyBossMods. And if you don't know what these mods do, they essentially provide callouts for you. Like, hey, here comes Final Sting, or here comes a Doom mechanic, or spread, or stack, and stuff like that. And a lot of these come by way in Final Fantasy XIV by plugins in ACT. So now that you know what I'm talking about, let's talk about the juicy topic at hand. Now, this person says that the general consensus around the community is that Final Fantasy XIV attracts more casual player base and less of the population are interested in difficult content. I think the truth here is that Final Fantasy XIV high-end duty is actually more difficult because players are reliant on themselves to be aware of mechanics and what is happening rather than reliant on third-party tools that walks them through the fight. For example, some time ago, I was leading a PF group, Party Finder, random people, not static members, through Seat of Sacrifice extreme runs. The first couple of runs, we had issues with people forgetting about certain mechanics and not just being aware of what was happening. So then I started typing out small reminders before each set of mechanical phases. For example, ice, if the bosses did the ice telegraph, which you would use 2 moves later, or meteors after adds to indicate that the boss will use LB3 after whichever job mechanics the boss decides to use. Lo and behold, that seems to have fixed all the mechanical issues with that group in the next 5 clears we did before having to disband. I think it goes to the same line of thought as learning to fight with someone raid leading callouts where to go. For example, if you have the raid lead or someone always tells you where to go to the safe spot, you never bother learning why the spot is safe or the timing of the mechanic itself, since you're reliant on something to be aware of it for you, unless you try to identify those specifically for yourself. Are there any players out there that honestly felt daunted by more challenging content simply because there is no tools like DeadlyBossMods that sort of guide you through the fight? And the top comment definitely deserves to be at the top comment. This guy says, he says, DBM is both a cancer and an adaptation to the game that is WoW. And I think, where did he say that at? There was a really good sentence in here that I was like, wow. Oh, here it is. Not that I like DBM. I left WoW right around the time it first started to become mandatory if you wanted to raid. I saw it as a product of bad game design. If your encounters can't provide you with the tools to defeat them without using some third-party program, then you have a badly designed encounter. And I agree with that. And this is not exclusive to WoW. This is not something that's just in WoW. Final Fantasy XIV also has some badly designed encounters when we talk about this stuff. And I think back to like 2.0 fights, and mainly some of the 2.0, some of the Heavensward fights where they, I think a lot of you WoW refugees will know about Circus Tower, and on the final boss, there's an indicator that something is happening around people, but you don't know if it's a stack or if you don't know if it's a spread. Later on in the game, those indicators change to arrows pointing in or arrows pointing out. That way you know if you need a stack or a spread. And in Circus Tower, it's not clear. So a lot of times we have to tell the new people, we have to tell the sprouts, when we get to the final boss, if there's some circles, you need to stack because it's not obvious. And people don't know. They would run away. Someone would run away like, I don't want to get the party killed, and you're supposed to stack, and it's a mess. Those of you who've done Crystal Tower know what I'm talking about. That's just an example of some bad telegraphs that were in Final Fantasy XIV, and which have since been addressed in later fights. You're kind of, and some of the, you know, post mid Heavensward and on those fights, the telegraphs are pretty obvious. They're very obvious, to where you don't necessarily need a mod like CACBot or DeadlyBossMods or something like that, or GTFO to tell you what to do. Now, I'm speaking strictly from a Final Fantasy XIV perspective, and I think that I think just overall, the fun in raiding and in dungeons is learning the mechanics on the spot. What you guys call blind runs. I've always been a fan of that. I never want to know what to do before going into a fight cold. I always try to figure it out, because that, to me, it's like a puzzle to me. It's like figuring out a puzzle. When you figure out a puzzle without any help, there's some gratification to that. And the same is true, man. It's like, I bet the same is true in WoW. People like to go through stuff blind. They don't want to read dungeon guides. They don't want to go to YouTube videos. The people that was in PTR, they want to go through it blind. And I'm the same way. The only time I will go to a guide is if I wipe to something many, many times, or I'll ask my chat if I'm live. Like a perfect example is in Delubrum Regine. One of the chess piece bosses where, you guys probably remember this, where there's these small bombs and these big bombs, right? And I never knew. I thought it was just always the same pattern. The first time you go to big bomb, second time you go to the little bomb. I had no idea that there was a pattern to this. So when I got to the final boss, and that, you know, because the first time you encounter it, there's always big, little, big, little. When you go to the final boss, they repeat that mechanic, and it's random. So I was doing the same thing I did before, and I would die. And I was like, what's going on? And I would try to figure it out, and I couldn't figure it out. So I finally asked chat, and my chat room knows that I like to figure out stuff. So I forgot who it was. It might have been Therasol or Crack Killer. I forgot who said, but they said if the bomb is tethered, if there's a tether, you go to the small every time. And I'm like, you know, I didn't know that, but it felt good to try to do it myself before figuring that out. Now, if there was a mod like CACBot or DeadlyBossMods, it'd be like, run to small bomb, beware, run, coward, run, little girl, run, you know, whatever it says. They will tell you where to go. And I don't know, man. To me, that ruins the fun. But I don't let that's not going to ruin the game, if you ask me. Now here's what I think will ruin the game. And I think it was this guy who said it too. He said that it was another comment in here that said that if, you know, DBM or some mod becomes a mainstay, the developers will build their dungeons and their raids surrounding that mod. So they will try to counter not only the player base and the design of the game, but they would counter DBM. So they will put stuff in the game to make the raid hard, even if you have DBM. And that is where I think a problem is. If you're designing your game around a mod, then your game needs to be looked at pretty hard. You need to look at your base stuff to where you don't need DBM, instead of trying to design stuff around a mod that's trying to fix stuff that's in your base game. You know, it becomes this cylindrical or cyclical. Yeah, I was going to say cylindrical for some reason. Cyclical. You know what I'm trying to say. Cyclical event, and it leads to worse and worse and worse designs over time, and it's just gonna accumulate and be worse and worse. But personally, this is what I think. Here's my thing. I think DBM is not good for WoW. I do. I think it's not good for the game overall, simply because they're designing around it, and it makes you lazy. Let's be real. When you're going into a raid, you're not going to pay as much attention. as if Deadly Boss Mods weren't there. Now, this leads to the discussion also to where if you have someone doing callouts, because if you have a person doing callouts, it's essentially a human version of DBM. But here's the difference. It's not automated. That person can make mistakes. They have the human error factor. And if you're with that static, or if you've all developed, knowledge of the fight together, then that's an accumulation of all of your knowledge going into one person as a reminder. Like, I don't mind people saying, watch out for this or watch out for that, stack, here comes this. Here's the thing that made us wipe. Make sure you do this. Make sure to run to that. Healers go north, tanks go south, especially if a mechanic like changes every now and then. I think about Titania, how you have to split out in the different areas, north, south, east, and west, and just making sure you're standing in the right puddles and stuff. I'm thinking about Titania EX because that was the last one that I can really remember that I did. And it's like, it's just a little bit more satisfying if you have a human calling it out, because to me, that's more natural than having a program which knows the fight, tell you what to do every single time. I'm not a fan of it. But just to go to his point again, do we think that, that Final Fantasy's content is more challenging than World of Warcraft simply because of the crutches of DBM? And that's hard to answer. That really is hard to answer, mainly because WoW has designed their fights around DBM. And the only way we can truly answer that is if we go to a time before DBM existed, and that's like a long time ago, right? And to just pull DBM out of the situation and then compare it to Final Fantasy, it's apples and watermelons, it's not even remotely close. Personally, I think DBM makes fights easier, but that doesn't mean that the content is easier. So it's really an impossible thing to kind of answer on its own. But I can tell you though, when it comes to fights, EX and Savage raids are difficult. Okay. I've done heroic and WoW. I've never done mythic. Those are difficult. They are difficult. I'm not going to say any of these things are easy. And it really irks me when a WoW player comes to Final Fantasy and said this fight is easy, or a Final Fantasy player goes to WoW and say this fight is easy, when they're not, because you have to figure it out. The first time you go in, you're going to wipe. It's like every EX fight you do, you're going to wipe. You can't one-shot EX fights in Final Fantasy 14. It ain't going to happen. You don't one-shot those. You don't. If it were easy, if it were an easy fight, you would one-shot it. And you don't. You wipe. Many times. Sometimes probably enough to even have to reset the instance. For most EX fights. They're pretty freaking hard. Don't even get me started with Ultimate. You're going to be Ultimate for weeks before you even remotely come close to clearing it. Even if you're with people who know the fight. Because it's an 8-man fight, and there's so much responsibility per person than there is in the WoW Mythic raids. That doesn't mean that the WoW Mythic raids are less difficult. It's just that they're designed differently. Final Fantasy 14 8-man ultimates are designed to put a lot more emphasis on the individual. And WoW Mythic raids have crazy, stupid hard mechanics that a lot of people can mess up on, but you can still keep going in some cases. So, two different designs, two different games. I think both are hurt by this though. Cacbot, I want Square to ban that crap. I don't want it in the game because it doesn't help, man. It doesn't help. If you got something calling out everything you need to do, it's almost it's not exactly that, but it's getting close to like an aimbot in a shooter. It's just gonna aim for you. All you gotta do is push the fire button, and these bots will say run here. All you gotta do is run there, and all you gotta do is do it. It's a little bit less more than an aimbot, but still. I guess it's more equivalent to like a wall hack. There you go. It's more like a wall hack. You can see where the enemy is. You just have to go and shoot them. That's how I think about these mods. And I really think they should be illegal. I was kind of surprised that they were allowed. Where they just play the game for you. And I don't like them. I don't like them at all. I don't like Cacbot. I don't like DBM. I don't like any of them. Even though I've used them, and when I did use them, I felt dirty. I was like, ugh, I don't like this. I don't like this. But that doesn't mean that the content is less difficult or more difficult. And I think that's where this thread is going and asking, is it a crutch? No, it's not a crutch. I think it's a bad decision and bad design. Because WoW content is difficult with or without Deadly Boss mods. Just like Final Fantasy content is difficult without CACbot. And with all that being said, though, people really, really need to give Final Fantasy XIV rating a fair shot. Because this is from a Final Fantasy XIV perspective. A lot of people think that Final Fantasy XIV content is easy and they don't get past Heavensward. They don't get past mid-Heavensward. That's like, I don't even know what the equivalent to Heavensward in WoW is. Probably one of the earlier expansions. That's like comparing something from way back then to now. You know, those were early raids. They had different designs. They had different mindsets. If you go and play something from Stormblood on, if you do the Stormblood, even, even like Coils in 2.0 was ridiculously hard by today's standards. It was actually, some of the hardest content in the game is Coils. It was like the first Savage level content in the game. And it was optional, of course. But a lot of those people who talk trash about Final Fantasy have never even tried Coils. Or they went in Coils with Echo on, or with Synced with like super high level gear that was nowhere near where it was. They don't go mid-eye level and no Echo. And that stuff was hard, man. That was like the first Savage level content in the game. And we won't talk about Gordius and Alexander, where that's when Final Fantasy was actually broken, where the fights were too freaking hard. And that was the birth of DPS healers. A lot of people don't know that, is that before Gordius, before Heavensward, healers healed like they did in WoW. But all of a sudden, the DPS checks were so freaking tight that if the healers didn't DPS, you didn't make the DPS check. So that's where that came from, and that design kind of stuck with the game, and it oddly made healing a lot more fun than just straight up healing. With occasional DPS, instead of now you're focusing on DPS and you pop big cooldowns to heal everybody at once so that you can do big heals so that you can do more DPS. But anyway, man, if you guys use DBM, let me know in the comments if I'm right or wrong. If you guys use CACbot, get out of my game. Let us know in the comments if we're off. But this is a great discussion. You can join the discussion on Reddit, or you can join in my comments here. What do you guys think? You think that DBM is a good thing, a bad thing? If you think CACbot is a good thing, you're wrong. And the difficulty of raids is so indicative of design, more so than the game itself. It's like raid design and dungeon design. And Final Fantasy is, everybody talks about it. It's a dance. You know, you're juggling through a lot of moving around and call outs and stacking and positioning while you're doing a whole bunch of rotation stuff. Like crazy amounts of off GCD weaving and stuff, and timing of stuff. It's really a mental thing. It's a really mental drain. And I'm not going to try to describe WoW because I haven't done enough WoW rating to even comment on it. But it's a different design. It's a different type of difficulty. And I think the people who are doing Final Fantasy rating now, who came from WoW, are starting to understand that this is not easy at all. It's just a different type of difficulty. Great discussion, though. It's a great discussion. I think it'll lead to better raids designs if some of these developers join in on these discussions. And you know, DBM, man, they need to. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. The reason why I don't like it mainly is because it puts stuff that should be on like YouTube inside the game itself. I don't mind guides being on YouTube. That's fine. That's been around forever. But when you got something holding your hand inside the game like that, that is really an aimbot or like a wall hack to me. It really is. It's equivalent to that. All right, guys, let me know in the comments what you think. I'll be watching and I'll be replying. All right, take care. Have a good day.